Out in the Timor Sea, a drifting vessel was first observed in 2006 moving without escort, without signal, and without any visible markings that could place it within the known patterns of commercial or fishing activity in the region. Its hull carried the dull wear of long exposure to salt and sun, yet nothing about its condition immediately explained how it had arrived there, or why it seemed to exist outside every expected record of maritime movement, as if it had slipped away from the systems designed to keep ships accounted for. What you're about to follow is not the story of a single failure at sea, but of a vessel that resisted identification at every level of modern maritime verification, where you will move through the quiet escalation from local inspection to global database searches, through the traces found on board, and through the silence of systems that should have recognized it but did not. Each stage reveals less about where the ship came from, and more about how something can remain physically present in the ocean, while becoming increasingly absent from every framework meant to define it. A tanker adrift in Australian waters. Across the far northern edge of Australia lies a stretch of water that has long resisted easy observation. The Gulf of Carpentaria, bordered by the Cape York Peninsula to the east and Arnhem Land to the west, covers an immense area of shallow sea where commercial shipping routes intersect, with remote coastlines and vast distances separate one settlement from the next. From above, much of the Gulf appears calm and empty, but beneath that appearance is a region that has occupied the attention of maritime authorities for decades. Fishing vessels move through its waters, weather systems shift rapidly across its surface, and the enormous scale of the region creates opportunities for activities that can easily escape notice. It was within this isolated maritime landscape that a routine patrol in 2006 encountered something that seemed ordinary at first glance, yet would soon become one of the most puzzling discoveries ever made in Australian waters. In March of that year, an Australian Coast Watch surveillance aircraft was conducting a routine monitoring flight over the Gulf. Such patrols were a normal part of border protection efforts, particularly in northern waters where authorities regularly watched for illegal fishing operations and other unauthorised maritime activity. The aircraft crew was expected to document vessels moving through the region and verify that they were operating lawfully. Instead, their attention was drawn toward a large ship drifting through the water without any obvious purpose. The vessel was approximately 80 metres long, large enough to be immediately noticeable from the air, and it was positioned roughly 180 kilometres southwest of Weipa, on the western coast of Cape York Peninsula. At first, the tanker's presence raised a practical question rather than a mysterious one. Large ships occasionally experience mechanical problems, and vessels can sometimes be found waiting for assistance or sheltering from unfavourable conditions. Yet the longer the surveillance crew observed the tanker, the less sense the situation appeared to make. The vessel was not following a recognisable course. It was moving slowly with the current rather than under apparent power, drifting southward through Australian territorial waters, with no visible indication that anyone was actively controlling it. There was no sign of course correction, no evidence of navigation, and no activity visible on deck. The aircraft continued gathering photographs and observations as it circled overhead. What emerged from those images deepened concern almost immediately. Hanging from the bow was a broken tow rope that trailed behind the vessel in the water. The sight suggested that the tanker had recently been connected to another ship and that the connection had somehow failed. Broken tow lines are not unheard of in maritime operations, particularly when aging vessels are being moved across long distances, but they normally lead to an immediate response. A towing company reports the incident. Authorities are notified. Efforts are made to recover the drifting vessel before it becomes a hazard to navigation. Yet nothing about this ship suggested that anyone was searching for it. Even more troubling was the absence of people. The surveillance crew could not identify a single crew member on deck, despite the vessel's size and despite the clear visibility available from the aircraft. Commercial ships are rarely silent places. Crews work on deck, monitor equipment, perform maintenance, and respond to passing aircraft. This tanker showed none of those signs. It seemed strangely lifeless as it drifted across the Gulf, carried only by wind, current, and momentum. The photographs revealed another detail that experienced observers immediately recognised as unusual. No flag could be seen flying from the vessel. Under normal circumstances, a ship displays the national flag of the country under whose laws it operates. The practice is fundamental to international maritime operations because it identifies the vessel's legal status and nationality. Ships may change ownership, routes, and destinations throughout their lives, but they do not simply abandon their identity. The absence of a visible flag did not automatically indicate wrongdoing, yet combined with everything else the aircraft crew was seeing, it contributed to a growing sense that this was not a routine maritime incident. When the surveillance aircraft returned and delivered its photographs, Australian authorities began reviewing the images in greater detail. What they found raised still more questions. The location where a ship's name would normally appear on the stern seemed strangely blank. There was no clearly visible vessel name, no obvious identification, and no easy way to determine where the tanker had come from. Maritime authorities are accustomed to tracing vessels through registries, radio communications, and visible markings. In this case, even the most basic starting point appeared to be missing. The decision was made to investigate directly. Australian Customs dispatched the patrol vessel Storm Bay to intercept the drifting tanker. By the time the patrol boat reached the ship, darkness had fallen, and officers chose to maintain position nearby until daylight provided safer boarding conditions. Through the night, the mysterious vessel continued drifting. It made no attempt to communicate, transmitted no distress call, and showed no visible signs of life. The silence surrounding it only intensified the questions that had emerged since its discovery. Morning brought the opportunity to board. Officers launched a tender and approached the tanker, expecting at a minimum to encounter a crew or some explanation for the unusual circumstances. Instead, they found themselves stepping onto a vessel that seemed abandoned not recently, but deliberately. The deck offered none of the normal indications of an active commercial ship. There was no welcoming crew, no explanation waiting to be provided, and no immediate clue capable of resolving the mystery that had begun with the surveillance flight. What the boarding party discovered over the following hours transformed a strange maritime sighting into an international investigation. The tanker was not simply drifting without assistance. Something far more unusual had happened before it entered Australian waters. The broken tow rope was only the first clue, and every new observation pointed toward the possibility that someone had gone to considerable effort before allowing the vessel to drift free. The questions now extended far beyond where the ship had come from. Investigators needed to determine who owned it, who had last operated it, why it had been abandoned, and why a vessel of such size appeared to exist without any obvious identity. Those answers should have been easy to find because every legitimate ship leaves records wherever it travels, and every commercial vessel carries information that links it to a nation, a registry, and a documented history. The tanker drifting through the Gulf of Carpentaria seemed determined to challenge that assumption. A ship that should have been impossible. Only a direct examination of the vessel offered any hope of discovering what had been removed, and what might remain behind. Long before a vessel appears on the horizon, its existence is usually recorded in places most people never see. Modern shipping operates within a web of documentation that stretches across oceans, governments, insurance providers, port authorities, classification societies, and international organizations. Every commercial ship leaves traces behind as it moves through this system, creating records that follow it from construction to retirement. Most of those records are invisible to the public, existing in databases and registries maintained far from the sea itself, yet they form the backbone of global maritime commerce. The average cargo ship may travel thousands of miles without attracting attention, but its identity is never truly lost because the system is designed to ensure that someone, somewhere, always knows what it is. Across modern shipping lanes, anonymity is treated less as a possibility than as a problem that international regulations were designed to prevent. The oceans remain vast, but the movement of large commercial vessels has become increasingly structured over the last century. Governments require registration, ports demand documentation, insurers require proof of ownership and operational history. International agreements establish standards that allow vessels from different nations to be recognized and tracked as they move between jurisdictions. These measures were not created merely for administrative convenience. They exist because ships carry cargo, transport people, cross national boundaries, and occasionally become involved in accidents, disputes, or criminal investigations. Identification is what allows responsibility to be assigned when something goes wrong. For the officers reviewing the photographs from the Gulf of Carpentaria, establishing a ship's identity should have been the simplest part of the investigation. The vessel itself was hardly inconspicuous. At roughly 80 meters in length and displacing approximately 2,000 tons, It was not a small fishing boat capable of slipping unnoticed through remote waterways. It was a substantial steel vessel operating inside Australian territorial waters. In most cases, investigators would begin with visible markings, check available registries, contact relevant authorities, and determine ownership within a relatively short period of time. Large ships generally leave large footprints. The expectation was that answers would follow quickly once the proper inquiries began. Where investigators normally begin finding answers, they instead encountered an unusual silence. The photographs taken from the surveillance aircraft revealed no clearly visible registration details. No flag could be identified. No obvious home port appeared on the hull. Most troubling of all was the apparent absence of a clearly displayed vessel name. Commercial ships traditionally carry their names in locations intended to be visible from a distance, allowing authorities, other vessels, and port operators to identify them quickly. The absence of that information immediately complicated what should have been a routine process. Before investigators could determine where the tanker had come from, they first had to determine what it actually was. Among the safeguards built into international maritime commerce, few are considered more important than the permanent identification systems attached to commercial vessels. Throughout history, ships have changed names for many reasons. Ownership transfers, company mergers, financial restructuring, and changes in national registration can all result in a vessel operating under a different identity than the one it carried when first launched. Because names can change, maritime authorities developed systems intended to provide continuity regardless of what was painted on a ship's hull. Those systems help investigators trace a vessel through decades of service, connecting its present condition to its documented past. Unlike a painted name or a national flag, certain markers are intended to survive every change a ship experiences throughout its working life. One of the most significant is the International Maritime Organization number, commonly known as an IMO number. Introduced to improve maritime safety and accountability, the identifier remains attached to a vessel throughout its existence, regardless of changes in ownership, nationality, or operating company. It functions much like a permanent serial number. Even if a ship is renamed multiple times, its IMO number continues linking it to historical records accumulated over years or even decades of operation. Investigators examining an unidentified vessel would normally expect such a number to provide an immediate path toward establishing its history. Yet the deeper authorities examined the drifting tanker, the more difficult it became to reconcile the vessel with the rules governing legitimate shipping. The problem was not simply that information was difficult to locate. The problem was that information appeared to be absent altogether. Authorities searched for evidence that would normally survive changes in ownership and registration. They looked for identifiers capable of connecting the vessel to a nation, a company, a previous registry, or an earlier name. The expectation was that at least one surviving clue would provide a starting point. Instead, the trail seemed to disappear before it even began. Missing paperwork might have been explained away as negligence, damage, or a simple circumstance. Documents can be lost, logbooks can be destroyed by water, registration papers can be misplaced. Maritime investigators are accustomed to dealing with incomplete records. A missing document may create complications, but it rarely creates a mystery. Ships operate within overlapping systems of accountability, meaning that information lost in one location can often be recovered elsewhere. A vessel's history is usually scattered across enough independent records that complete disappearance becomes extraordinarily difficult. Taken individually, each absent detail could have been dismissed as an inconvenience. A missing flag might have been removed during maintenance. Faded markings might have been obscured by weathering. Incomplete paperwork might have resulted from poor record keeping. Even a damaged identification plate could potentially be explained by age or neglect. Yet investigators were not confronting a single missing detail. They were confronting the absence of nearly every obvious means of identification at the same time. What initially appeared unusual gradually began to seem statistically improbable. What emerged from those early inquiries was not the profile of a lost ship, but the outline of something deliberately obscured. The distinction mattered because maritime accidents often leave behind disorder, while deliberate concealment tends to produce a different pattern entirely. When information disappears naturally, traces usually remain. Contradictions emerge, partial records survive. Witnesses remember fragments of events. In this case, authorities were encountering something closer to a void. Every avenue that should have produced answers instead reinforced the same unsettling conclusion. The vessel's connection to its own history appeared to have been systematically weakened. As information circulated through investigative channels, attention increasingly focused on the implications rather than the immediate facts. An unidentified vessel drifting through Australian waters was certainly unusual, but unidentified vessels occasionally appear under extraordinary circumstances. What concerned authorities was the scale of the anomaly. This was not a small craft operating on the margins of maritime regulation. It was a substantial commercial vessel that should have accumulated years of documentation, inspections, transactions, and regulatory oversight. Somewhere in the world, records should have existed. Somewhere, there should have been evidence of construction, ownership, operation, or registration. Yet investigators found themselves confronting a ship that seemed detached from all of those things. By the time the initial searches were completed, investigators faced a question far more troubling than ownership. If a vessel of this size could drift into Australian territorial waters without providing any reliable indication of where it belonged, then the mystery extended beyond the tanker itself. It raised questions about what had happened before the vessel was discovered, who had last exercised control over it, and why every obvious path toward identification appeared to lead nowhere. The challenge was no longer finding a ship's name. The challenge was understanding how a ship could arrive carrying so little of its past. The answers, if any remained at all, were waiting aboard, the boarding of an empty shell. Morning brought investigators to the place where the mystery could no longer be studied from afar. Through photographs and surveillance reports, authorities had already established that the drifting tanker was unusual, but distance had imposed limits on what could be known. Images could reveal a broken tow rope, an empty deck, and a lack of obvious identification, yet they could not explain how the vessel had reached Australian waters or why it appeared disconnected from every system that normally tracks commercial shipping. To move beyond speculation, officers would have to step onto the ship itself. Somewhere within its steel hull, they hoped to find evidence capable of connecting the vessel to a past that seemed increasingly difficult to locate. Stepping onto the deck offered no immediate explanation for how the tanker had arrived in Australian waters. The vessel remained afloat and structurally intact, retaining the outward appearance of a working commercial ship despite its strange circumstances. Rust and weathering marked portions of the exterior, but nothing about its condition suggested a recent catastrophe. From a distance, it could still be mistaken for a vessel in ordinary service. Yet the absence of movement quickly distinguished it from every functioning ship investigators had encountered before. No crew appeared to greet the boarding party, no voices carried across the deck, no indication emerged that anyone remained aboard. Silence settled over nearly every part of the vessel the boarding party entered. Even ships operating with small crews produce a constant backdrop of sound. Engines vibrate through steel bulkheads. Pumps cycle on and off. Ventilation systems circulate air through passageways and compartments. Radios transmit routine communications. Footsteps echo through corridors as crew members move between duties. Such sounds become so familiar aboard commercial vessels that their absence is often more noticeable than their presence. Aboard this tanker, the quiet seemed to follow investigators from compartment to compartment, reinforcing the impression that whatever activity had once taken place here had ended long before the vessel drifted into Australian waters. Ordinary signs of life were among the first things authorities expected to encounter. Commercial ships serve as temporary homes as much as workplaces, and crews inevitably leave traces of daily routines behind. Cabins usually contain clothing, toiletries, books, photographs, food supplies, and countless small items accumulated during weeks or months at sea. Even vessels abandoned under unusual circumstances often preserve fragments of the lives once lived aboard them. Such details can help investigators determine nationality, identify crew members, and reconstruct recent events. On this ship, however, those traces appeared remarkably scarce. Cabins that should have reflected the routines of a working crew offered surprisingly little. Investigators searched spaces where mariners would normally eat, sleep, and spend their limited free time between duties. The expectation was not that every room would be fully furnished or occupied, but that evidence of recent habitation would remain visible somewhere aboard. Instead, many spaces appeared stripped of the ordinary details that transform steel compartments into living quarters. The absence did not prove anything on its own. yet it contributed to a growing sense that the vessel had been emptied with unusual thoroughness. Elsewhere aboard the ship, the search turned toward the records that normally accompany every commercial voyage. Maritime operations generate documentation at every stage of a vessel's journey. Logbooks record daily activities and navigational decisions. Charts assist officers in plotting courses. Cargo records identify what a ship is transporting and where those goods are intended to go. Registration documents connect vessels to owners, companies, and national authorities. For investigators attempting to identify an unknown ship, paperwork often provides the fastest path toward answers because it links the physical vessel to a documented history beyond the horizon. Nothing about the missing paperwork suggested a hurried departure. Documents can disappear for many reasons, including weather damage, flooding, fire, or simple neglect. Yet those situations usually leave evidence behind. Water stains remain on shelves. Burned fragments survive inside compartments. Torn papers become lodged in corners or storage areas. Investigators found no such pattern. Instead, the records themselves appeared largely absent. The distinction was subtle but important. Missing records caused by an accident create disorder. Missing records caused by removal create emptiness. What made the absence more unusual was the number of questions those records should have answered. They should have identified the vessel's recent movements. They should have connected the tanker to a company, owner, or operating authority. They should have helped establish where the ship had been before it entered Australian waters. Without them, investigators remained trapped at the beginning of the story, unable to move backward through the vessel's history. The ship occupied physical space in front of them, yet much of its past remained concealed. Far below the upper decks, investigators found evidence that raised even more questions than the absent documents. Machinery spaces often preserve some of the most revealing information aboard a vessel because they reflect years of maintenance, repairs, modifications, and operational decisions. Even heavily weathered ships can provide clues through their mechanical systems. Engine manufacturers, maintenance markings, replacement parts, and technical records often help reconstruct a vessel's history when other evidence is unavailable. The expectation was that the lower compartments might succeed where the paperwork had failed. Component after component appeared to have vanished with remarkable precision. Reports from the investigation indicated that major elements associated with the vessel's propulsion systems had been removed. Rather than finding machinery damaged by accident or rendered inoperable through neglect, authorities encountered evidence of dismantling. Valuable components were missing while larger structures remained in place. The distinction mattered because it suggested intention. Mechanical failures occur unpredictably. Systematic removal requires planning, labour, and time. The deeper investigators examined the machinery spaces, the clearer that pattern became. Equipment had not simply disappeared at random. Certain parts appeared targeted while others remained untouched. Heavy structures too large or impractical to transport were left behind, while components possessing value or utility elsewhere were gone. The result was a vessel that retained the outward appearance of a ship, while lacking many of the systems required to function independently. What remained resembled the framework of a working tanker more than a working tanker itself. Beyond the engine spaces, the same pattern continued throughout the vessel. Equipment associated with navigation and communication was also missing. Modern maritime operations depend on communication systems that connect ships to coastal authorities and to the wider network of global shipping. Navigation equipment allows vessels to determine their positions, monitor surrounding traffic, and travel safely through open water. Investigators expected to encounter at least some of these systems aboard a commercial vessel of this size. Instead, many had been removed. The absence of communication equipment carried implications extending far beyond the ship itself. A vessel suffering mechanical problems can still request assistance if its communication systems remain operational. A stranded crew can report its location. A towing vessel can coordinate recovery efforts. By contrast, a ship stripped of those systems becomes isolated from the networks that normally document maritime activity. The tanker appeared not only disconnected from its history, but also disconnected from the mechanisms through which that history might have been traced. Taken together, the discoveries began to reveal a logic behind the emptiness. Missing documents, missing machinery, missing communications equipment, and missing personal traces all pointed toward a similar conclusion. investigators were not confronting the aftermath of a sudden emergency. They were encountering evidence of a process. The same decisions appeared to have been repeated throughout the vessel, suggesting that someone had spent considerable time determining what should remain and what should disappear. Unlike ships abandoned during crises, this tanker showed little evidence of panic or interruption. Maritime history contains many examples of vessels left behind under mysterious circumstances, yet those stories often include signs of lives abruptly interrupted. Meals remain unfinished, personal possessions are left scattered throughout cabins, equipment stays where it was last used. Such scenes convey haste. The tanker drifting through the Gulf of Carpentaria presented a markedly different picture. The ship felt less like a place people had fled, and more like a place they had systematically emptied. With each compartment that was examined, the distinction between abandonment and erasure became harder to ignore. Investigators had boarded the vessel expecting to uncover clues regarding ownership and origin. Instead, they found themselves confronting evidence that many of those clues had been deliberately removed before the ship was ever discovered. The mystery was no longer limited to identifying an unknown vessel. It now involved understanding why someone had invested such effort in severing the ship's connection to its own past. Near the conclusion of the search, one overlooked detail finally interrupted the pattern of absence. For hours, investigators had moved through spaces defined by what was missing rather than what remained. Every compartment seemed to reinforce the same conclusion. The vessel had been stripped of information. Yet complete erasure is difficult to achieve, particularly aboard a ship built from steel and intended to endure decades at sea. Somewhere amid the surfaces that had been altered and obscured, a small imperfection in that effort began to emerge. Beneath layers of paint, one of the few surviving clues had been waiting in plain sight. The faint name beneath the paint. Years of repainting, weather and neglect had transformed the vessel's exterior into a layered record of its own history, though most of that history remained hidden from view. Throughout the search for the tanker, investigators had encountered absence after absence. Documents were gone, equipment had been removed, personal traces were remarkably scarce. The vessel seemed defined by what was missing rather than what remained. By the time the boarding operation neared its conclusion, expectations for a major discovery had diminished considerably. If someone had truly intended to disconnect the ship from its past, they had already been remarkably successful. Beneath weathered layers of paint, investigators noticed evidence that a deliberate effort to obscure the vessel's history had not been entirely successful. Commercial ships are repainted throughout their working lives for practical reasons. Salt water corrodes steel, sunlight fades surfaces, and years of operation leave visible wear on hulls and superstructures. Layers accumulate over time, sometimes preserving traces of earlier markings beneath newer coats. What initially appeared to be nothing more than weathered paint began attracting closer attention, because subtle irregularities suggested that something had once existed underneath. Unlike the missing documents and dismantled equipment, this clue had survived by accident rather than design. Removing paperwork is relatively straightforward. Dismantling machinery requires effort but remains entirely possible. Paint behaves differently. Every layer covers what came before it, yet older markings can sometimes reappear through weathering, erosion, or imperfect repainting. The process is rarely dramatic. A letter emerges as a shadow. A shape becomes faintly visible beneath the surface. Tiny inconsistencies begin suggesting that the visible exterior does not tell the entire story. In this case, those inconsistencies suddenly carried enormous significance. Gradually, the faded markings began to suggest a name that had once been displayed more prominently on the vessel. Investigators examining the ship identified traces indicating the name Jian Seng. It was not the kind of discovery that instantly solved a mystery. No detailed history appeared alongside it. No ownership records emerged from hidden compartments. Yet after hours spent moving through a vessel stripped of so much identifying information, even a possible name represented an important breakthrough. For the first time since the tanker had been discovered drifting through Australian waters, authorities possessed something resembling an identifiable lead. The discovery mattered because names occupy a unique place in maritime investigations. A vessel's name serves as a connection point linking the physical ship to records scattered across ports, registries, shipping companies, insurers, and government agencies. Even when ships change ownership or registration, traces of those changes often survive somewhere within the maritime system. Investigators therefore reviewed the appearance of the name not as the end of the mystery, but as the beginning of a potentially productive search. The assumption was straightforward. If the vessel had once operated as Jian Seng, then somewhere there should be evidence explaining where it came from and who had operated it. For the first time since the tanker entered Australian waters, authorities possessed something they could actively pursue. Up to that point, much of the investigation had involved examining what remained aboard the vessel itself. Now the focus began shifting outward. Maritime records, registry databases, and international shipping information offered potential avenues for tracing the ship's past. The mystery had expanded beyond the drifting tanker in the Gulf of Carpentaria and into a search stretching across the wider maritime world. Maritime investigations often change direction the moment a ship can be connected to a name. In many cases, a vessel's identity unlocks years of accumulated history. Ownership records reveal transfers between companies, port visits establish movement patterns, inspection reports document modifications and maintenance. Insurance information identifies responsible parties. Even older vessels often leave extensive trails because commercial shipping depends upon documentation. Authorities expected the discovery of the name Jian Seng to initiate that process. The challenge no longer seemed to be finding a lead. The challenge appeared to be following one. Initial searches created the impression that answers might finally be within reach. Investigators examined available information and attempted to connect the tanker to existing records. The name itself suggested possible avenues for inquiry, and maritime authorities began looking for evidence that could confirm where the vessel had been registered or who had operated it. Under ordinary circumstances, a commercial ship measuring approximately 80 meters in length should have generated a substantial documentary footprint. Ships of that size do not move invisibly through international waters. They require maintenance, fuel, crews, and logistical support. Each activity typically leaves records behind. Registry checks and database inquiries soon revealed that tracing the vessel would be far more complicated than expected. The apparent breakthrough failed to produce the clarity investigators had anticipated. Instead of uncovering a detailed history, authorities encountered uncertainty. The available information proved insufficient to establish a clear and verified chain connecting the discovered vessel to a documented operational past. The problem was not merely that records were incomplete. The problem was that the name itself seemed incapable of providing the certainty investigators expected. What appeared at first to be a breakthrough gradually produced a new set of uncertainties. The vessel's condition already suggested that significant efforts had been made to obscure its origins. As authorities attempted to reconstruct its history, they encountered the consequences of that apparent erasure. Every unanswered question regarding ownership, registration and operation became more significant because the physical evidence aboard the ship offered so little assistance. The name had survived, but the broader framework that should have surrounded it remained frustratingly difficult to locate. Conflicting details and incomplete information prevented investigators from building a straightforward narrative explaining the vessel's past. Large commercial ships typically leave evidence wherever they operate, whether through port records, inspections, maintenance activities, or ownership transactions. The tanker drifting in Australian waters seemed unusually resistant to that process. Even with a potential name available, the ship continued to occupy a strange position between identification and anonymity. It was no longer entirely unknown, yet it remained far from understood. The deeper authorities followed the lead, the less straightforward the vessel's story became. Rather than reducing uncertainty, the investigation revealed how many questions remained unresolved. Who had last controlled the ship before it was abandoned? Why had so many identifying features been removed? Where had the vessel been operating before it entered Australian waters? If Jian Seng truly represented its former identity, why had so little verifiable information survived alongside the name itself? Each inquiry seemed to generate another. By then, the significance of the discovery no longer rested solely in the name itself. The faded markings demonstrated that complete erasure had not been achieved, but they also highlighted the limitations of the evidence available to investigators. A name can point toward a history, yet it cannot guarantee access to that history. The vessel remained disconnected from many of the records and identifiers that normally allow authorities to reconstruct a ship's past with confidence. What survived beneath the paint was therefore valuable less because it solved the mystery, and more because it revealed how much of the mystery remained. Rather than identifying the ship with certainty, the faded markings highlighted the extraordinary effort that appeared to have gone into obscuring its origins. The discovery of the name Jian Seng transformed the investigation from a search without leads into a search with an uncertain lead, and there is an important difference between the two. An absence of clues leaves investigators with nowhere to begin. A partial clue offers direction but no guarantee of answers. As authorities continued examining the vessel and the evidence it contained, they increasingly recognized that the tanker might reveal more about its recent purpose than about its documented history. Among the few clues that remained aboard, the vessel's cargo promised to reveal far more than its name ever had: rice, rust, and a broken tow line. Off the remote northern waters of Australia, where the Timor Sea opens into vast, lightly patrolled stretches of ocean, maritime patrols occasionally encounter vessels that do not immediately fit into any known registry or expected route. Yet even among such anomalies, few arrive in a condition as quietly unsettling as the small freighter later identified as Jian Seng. Drifting without a clear flag state and without a functioning system of identification that could place it within the normal architecture of international shipping. When Australian authorities approached the vessel in March 2006, what they found was not a scene of visible disaster or dramatic destruction, but something far more ambiguous: a ship that appeared structurally intact yet stripped of the basic elements that would normally explain its presence at sea, as though it had been reduced to a floating shell that still carried the weight of its last incomplete purpose. The first impressions recorded by boarding teams did not point toward a singular cause or event, but rather a layered absence, where every detail that should have clarified the ship's identity or voyage instead deepened the uncertainty surrounding how long it had been moving without being meaningfully seen. Inside the cargo holds, the most immediate and physically tangible clue was not machinery or documentation, but a shipment of rice, stored in bulk in a way that suggested commercial intent rather than emergency provisioning, its presence indicating that at some point the vessel had been engaged in a routine function of maritime trade, likely within the broader network of bulk cargo distribution that operates across Southeast Asian shipping lanes. Yet the condition of the cargo complicated any straightforward interpretation, because while rice is a standard commodity in regional trade, its presence aboard a vessel that showed no functioning propulsion systems, no active communication equipment, and no verifiable registry created a contradiction that investigators could not easily resolve, since such cargo normally implies a defined departure point, a destination, and a documented chain of custody across ports and loading facilities. Instead, what was found suggested disconnection from that chain, as though the cargo belonged to a phase of the ship's life that had already ended, even if the vessel itself had continued moving afterward, detached from the administrative and logistical systems that would normally account for it. Compounding the uncertainty was the condition of the ship's structure and internal environment, where rust patterns and corrosion were present in ways that indicated prolonged exposure to salt water and neglect, yet without the kind of catastrophic failure that would suggest a sudden sinking or collision, pointing instead toward a gradual decline or extended period of drifting without maintenance. The corrosion was not uniform in a way that would clearly signal a single environmental event. Rather, it appeared uneven and progressive, suggesting that different parts of the vessel had been exposed to stress and abandonment over time, possibly under shifting conditions that did not allow for a single narrative of loss. In maritime investigations, such physical degradation often becomes a timeline in itself, a silent record of time spent without care or oversight, and in this case it reinforced the sense that whatever operational life the ship once had already been interrupted long before it was discovered in Australian waters. Even more telling than the cargo and the rusted structure was the absence of systems that would normally define a vessel's ongoing existence in global shipping networks, including the lack of operational communication equipment and the apparent removal of identifying features that could have linked the ship to a flag state or shipping company. Without these markers, the rice cargo stood isolated as one of the only remaining pieces of evidence pointing to commercial activity, yet it could not, on its own, establish where the ship had come from or where it had been intended to go. Investigators were left with a paradox in which the cargo suggested integration into a functioning trade system, while the ship itself appeared detached from that system entirely, as if it had crossed an invisible threshold from regulated commerce into untracked movement without leaving a clear record of when or how that transition occurred. The broken tow line found aboard added another layer of interpretive difficulty, not because it provided a direct explanation, but because it implied a prior interaction with external forces, possibly towing operations or attempts at recovery that were never completed or formally recorded in accessible maritime databases. Tow lines in themselves are not unusual in maritime contexts, especially for vessels experiencing mechanical failure or transiting under assistance, but the presence of a broken line without corresponding documentation or nearby supporting vessels introduced the possibility that the Jian had once been under controlled movement before becoming fully adrift. Yet here again, the evidence resisted firm conclusions, as there were no confirmed reports that matched such an event in the relevant maritime corridors, leaving the tow line as a fragment of operational history that could not be anchored to a known incident or recorded assistance operation. Taken together, the rice cargo, the rust patterns, and the broken tow line formed a fragmented profile of a vessel that had once participated in ordinary maritime activity, but had at some point slipped outside the structures that normally govern such activity, entering a state where physical evidence remained but administrative and operational context had dissolved. In maritime investigations, such cases are particularly difficult because ships are not only physical objects but also administrative constructs, existing within registries, insurance frameworks, and communication systems that collectively define their legitimacy and purpose, and when those frameworks are absent, even intact physical evidence becomes difficult to interpret in isolation. The Jian Seng in this condition appeared less like a vessel that had simply been abandoned, and more like one that had been partially erased from the systems that would normally explain its continued existence at sea. What made the discovery especially difficult for investigators was not the presence of damage or cargo in itself, but the way in which each piece of evidence pointed toward a different stage of the ship's operational life, without ever aligning into a single coherent timeline, leaving open the possibility that the vessel had been repurposed, stripped, or diverted at some point after its original commercial function had ended. Rice suggested trade, rust suggested neglect, and the broken tow line suggested intervention, yet none of these elements could be definitively prioritized over the others, resulting in a composite picture that was structurally incomplete despite being physically present. In such cases, maritime analysis often turns to absence as much as presence, and here the absence of records, identifiers, and continuity became as significant as any material found on board, shaping the investigation into something that could not be resolved through evidence alone. As the boarding team completed its initial inspection, the vessel remained adrift not only in the physical sense, but also in an informational sense, suspended between interpretations that could not be confirmed or dismissed with certainty, leaving the Jian as a rare case in which the ordinary language of shipping, cargo, route, ownership, and purpose failed to fully apply, even as physical traces of that system still lingered in its holds and corridors, quietly resisting any attempt to define the ship's final operational identity. And in that unresolved space between function and erasure, the investigation continued forward into a deeper question of how a vessel with such ordinary cargo could become so completely detached from the ordinary world it once served. The presence of rice, rust, and a broken tow line did not resolve the ship's story. Instead, it only marked the point where its explanation began to fracture, in ways that suggested something far more deliberate had already taken place, long before it was found drifting in silence. A ship built to disappear. Beyond the limits of what the hull still physically revealed, the investigation began to shift toward what could no longer be accounted for, as if the most important evidence had already been removed before the vessel ever entered Australian waters. What remained afloat in the Timor Sea was not a complete narrative waiting to be decoded, but a partial structure whose most defining features were defined by their absence rather than their presence, forcing investigators to interpret not only what was visible on board the Jian, but what would normally have been impossible to remove without leaving a trace somewhere in the global maritime system. In such cases, maritime inspection does not proceed like a traditional search for damage or cause of failure, but rather like a reconstruction of functionality, where the absence of expected systems becomes its own form of evidence, suggesting that the vessel's condition may not have been the result of neglect alone, but of something far more deliberate in its reduction. Ordinarily, a cargo vessel of its size and construction would carry a tightly interlinked set of mechanical and navigational systems designed to keep it visible, controllable, and continuously registered within international maritime networks, where propulsion, communication, and identification operate not as independent components, but as an integrated framework that ensures the vessel's presence is always known to both its operators and external monitoring systems. Engines would provide movement under controlled power, navigation equipment would maintain course integrity across open waters, and communication systems would allow constant contact with port authorities and nearby vessels, while documentation and registry records would anchor the ship's identity within a legal and commercial structure that persists across borders and jurisdictions. When even one of these systems fails under normal circumstances, the disruption is typically visible in external records or distress communications, yet in the case of the Jian Seng, the expectation of partial failure gave way to something more unusual, because there was no corresponding trail of malfunction or recorded emergency to explain how the vessel arrived in such a stripped condition. Deep within the engineering spaces, the most critical absence was not damage or failure, but the complete disconnection of propulsion-related infrastructure that would normally define whether the ship could move under its own power, and this absence did not present itself as a simple breakdown or inoperative machinery, but as a condition where key components appeared to have been removed entirely, leaving behind spaces that suggested prior installation without offering evidence of recent collapse or catastrophic destruction. In maritime engineering, propulsion systems are not easily or casually lost. They are massive integrated structures that require coordinated dismantling, specialized equipment, and significant time to remove, which makes their absence in a structurally intact vessel particularly difficult to reconcile with scenarios of accident or abandonment alone. The implication was not merely that the ship could not move, but that it had been reduced to a state where movement had been intentionally severed from its physical capability, creating a vessel that could float but no longer function in any conventional operational sense. Across the sections where navigation and communication equipment would typically be mounted, investigators instead encountered mounting points, wiring paths, and structural housings that had been left without their functional components, suggesting that whatever systems once occupied those spaces had been removed in a way that preserved the surrounding structure while eliminating the equipment itself. This distinction is important in maritime examination, because accidental damage tends to leave behind fragmented or destroyed remnants of equipment, whereas deliberate removal often results in clean separation points, empty brackets, and intact conduits that once carried signals or power, but now serve only as traces of prior configuration. Without functioning communication systems such as radio transmitters or automatic identification systems, a vessel becomes increasingly difficult to track in real time, and without navigation electronics, its ability to independently operate within regulated sea lanes becomes significantly compromised. Yet the Jian Seng showed no indication that these systems had simply failed in place, reinforcing the impression that they had been physically removed rather than disabled by malfunction. Within the areas normally reserved for operational logs, registry papers, and ownership records, there was no equivalent documentation trail that could link the vessel to a recognized maritime identity, and this absence carried a different kind of weight than the missing machinery, because documentation is not merely operational, but administrative, connecting a vessel to legal ownership, insurance frameworks, port authorities, and international databases that collectively define its legitimacy at sea. In standard practice, even vessels that suffer catastrophic mechanical failure retain documentation that allows investigators to reconstruct their last known movements. But here, the absence extended beyond physical systems into the bureaucratic structures that would normally preserve a traceable history. The result was a condition where the ship could be physically examined but not easily placed within the administrative memory of global shipping, as though its existence had been partially excised from the records that typically outlast the vessel itself. When compared against known patterns of maritime abandonment or mechanical failure, the uniformity of what was missing began to suggest a level of removal that natural deterioration alone could not easily account for, because decay tends to be uneven, leaving behind remnants, partial systems, or at least degraded versions of equipment that can be linked back to operational history. Fires, collisions, and long-term neglect typically produce irregular damage patterns that still allow investigators to reconstruct a sequence of events, yet in this case, The absence of key systems appeared consistent across multiple categories, affecting propulsion, communication, and identification simultaneously in a way that reduced the vessel not into a damaged version of itself, but into a structurally intact body lacking the means to define its function. This consistency raised the possibility that the ship had not simply deteriorated over time, but had been subjected to a coordinated process in which its most traceable components were removed in advance of its final condition at sea. Layer by layer, the structural evidence implied that different systems had not disappeared simultaneously, but instead had been dismantled in a manner consistent with deliberate separation of function before abandonment, where mechanical capability, electronic visibility, and administrative identity were each stripped away in a way that prevented any single point of failure from explaining the ship's final state. In maritime environments, such staged removal is not part of ordinary abandonment scenarios because vessels are typically either left intact when abandoned or suffer damage that leaves identifiable remnants, whereas the pattern observed here suggested a progression that prioritized the elimination of traceability before the vessel was left adrift. This interpretation does not rely on speculation about who performed such actions, but on the structural logic of what remains when multiple independent systems are removed in a way that preserves the vessel's floatability while eliminating its operational footprint. Rather than presenting itself as a vessel lost to time or accident, the ship increasingly resembled something that had been intentionally reduced to a form that no longer satisfied the basic requirements of maritime existence, where buoyancy alone was insufficient to establish identity, purpose, or operational continuity within the frameworks that govern international waters. The hull remained, and with it the physical memory of construction and use, but everything that would normally allow the vessel to participate in global systems of recognition and control had been stripped away, leaving behind an object that could still occupy space, but could no longer meaningfully declare what it was or where it belonged. In this condition, the Jian did not behave like a broken ship awaiting repair or rescue, but like a structure that had been deliberately brought to the threshold of non-function, while preserving just enough physical integrity to remain afloat. Even within global tracking frameworks designed to prevent exactly this kind of uncertainty, the absence of identifiable transmission, registration continuity, and ownership linkage placed the vessel outside the reach of normal verification systems, not because those systems had failed in a conventional sense, but because there was nothing left on board to generate the data those systems depend on to function. Maritime surveillance relies on constant signals, periodic reporting, and cross-referenced identities that allow vessels to be monitored across vast distances. Yet the Jian presented a case where all such inputs were missing simultaneously, producing a blind spot that was not temporary but structural in nature. This condition exposed a rare limitation within global maritime oversight, where a vessel could still physically exist within monitored waters, while effectively becoming unreadable to the systems designed to observe it. As each missing system was considered together rather than in isolation, the pattern that emerged was not one of random decay, but of coordinated removal that left only a floating structure stripped of the means to define itself. And this cumulative absence transformed the vessel from a singular mystery into a layered problem of maritime identity, where every missing component reinforced the conclusion that the ship's final condition had been shaped by more than simple abandonment alone. What remained was not just a ship without function, but a ship without the structural prerequisites that normally allow function to be recognized or restored, placing it in a category of maritime anomaly defined less by what it had done than by what had been systematically taken away from it. Attention soon moved away from the immediate discovery site, as investigators began searching wider maritime systems for any surviving record that could identify the vessel's origin. The search across the maritime world. Following the escalation of uncertainty surrounding classification, global maritime authorities initiated a multi-layered process of verification designed to trace any possible administrative connection across interconnected shipping systems, where vessel identity is normally reconstructed not from a single source, but through the alignment of multiple independent records that collectively confirm existence, ownership, and operational continuity. In most maritime investigations, this process unfolds in a predictable sequence, beginning with immediate regional checks before expanding outward into international registries and specialized databases, each layer designed to capture different dimensions of a vessel's recorded life. What made this case increasingly difficult to resolve within those standard procedures was not an absence of effort, but the inability of those layered systems to converge on a shared reference point that could anchor the vessel within any established framework of maritime identity. The investigation did not stall in a single jurisdiction or database, but instead encountered consistent non-alignment across every system designed to cross-validate maritime existence. Australian maritime coordination units began the initial phase of structured inquiry, applying standardized identification protocols used for vessels entering monitored territorial waters without clear registration, a process that typically involves cross-referencing observed physical characteristics against known vessel types, documented fleets, and historical maritime records maintained within national oversight systems. These protocols are designed to resolve uncertainty quickly in most cases, particularly when dealing with commercial shipping traffic that operates within regulated corridors. Yet in this instance, the expected points of confirmation did not emerge, even at the earliest stage of structured classification. Instead, the vessel remained outside the immediate scope of recognizable categories, requiring escalation into broader systems of verification that extend beyond national jurisdiction. What initially appeared as a localized classification gap began to behave more like a systemic absence, once broader comparisons failed to restore continuity. National flag registries across multiple jurisdictions were subsequently queried to determine whether any recorded ownership transfers, reflagging activity, or historical listings matched the vessel's structural profile, since commercial ships frequently move between registries over their operational lifespan while retaining traceable continuity through administrative updates. These registries are designed to function as overlapping layers of maritime identity management, ensuring that even vessels undergoing frequent ownership or operational changes maintain a documented lineage across international boundaries. However, no corresponding record emerged that aligned with the vessel's observed configuration, and more significantly, no partial matches or historical fragments were identified that could suggest earlier registration under a different designation. The absence extended beyond a missing entry, and into the absence of even transitional traces that normally persist during administrative transfer. Commercial shipping databases were then engaged to compare vessel characteristics against global categories defined by tonnage, construction type, and operational designation frameworks, which are typically robust enough to accommodate a wide range of modifications, retrofits, and functional conversions that occur throughout a ship's service life. These systems rely on standardized classification logic that allows vessels to be grouped according to structural and operational similarities, enabling rapid identification even when documentation is incomplete or partially outdated. Yet in this case, the available parameters failed to align consistently with any known category, producing no stable classification outcome that could situate the vessel within established commercial shipping structures. Even broad categorization bands, which normally absorb ambiguity, could not accommodate the observed configuration. Automated vessel tracking systems, which typically generate continuous positional histories through onboard transmission data, were reviewed for any correlating signal patterns, as these systems form one of the primary mechanisms through which global maritime movement is recorded in real time. Under normal conditions, even intermittent transmission data can be reconstructed into navigational paths when combined with satellite observations and port entry records, allowing investigators to map vessel movement with reasonable accuracy over extended periods. In this instance, however, no coherent sequence of transmissions could be identified that corresponded to the vessel's presence, leaving a gap not only in positional history, but in the expected continuity of monitored maritime activity. The absence was not limited to a single interval, but extended across the temporal range in which the vessel was known to have been encountered. Port authority records across regional and international hubs were examined to establish whether any recorded arrivals or departures aligned with the vessel's observable specifications, since ports serve as critical verification points where physical movement intersects with administrative documentation. These records typically provide reliable anchors for reconstructing a vessel's operational timeline, linking cargo handling, inspection procedures, and entry or exit permissions into a coherent historical sequence. Despite this, no matching entries were found that corresponded to the vessel's characteristics within relevant operational periods, removing another key pathway through which maritime identity is normally confirmed. The absence of port linkage further deepened the separation between physical presence and administrative traceability. Maritime insurance frameworks and compliance registries were also consulted, as vessels engaged in commercial operations are ordinarily required to maintain active coverage and classification certification that links them to recognised underwriting and regulatory systems. These frameworks function as secondary verification layers, ensuring that even when tracking data is incomplete, financial and compliance records can still provide continuity of identity across jurisdictions. However, no corresponding insurance or certification records could be identified, further compounding the absence of administrative linkage across systems that typically operate in parallel. This lack of financial traceability removed yet another expected layer of verification that normally persists even in fragmented records. Integrated data comparison procedures were conducted in an attempt to reconcile overlapping inputs from independent maritime systems into a single identifiable record, a process that relies on cross-referencing shared attributes such as vessel dimensions, construction type, and operational behaviour across multiple datasets. In most cases, even fragmented information can be synthesized into a partial profile that narrows identification possibilities significantly. But here, the absence of consistent overlap between datasets prevented the formation of any coherent composite identity. Instead, each system produced isolated non-matches that could not be reconciled into a unified classification outcome. The result was not contradiction between systems, but mutual silence across them. Established vessel classification models, which typically accommodate a wide range of commercial and industrial ship types, failed to produce a stable categorization consistent across all datasets, despite their ability to incorporate modified, repurposed, or partially documented vessels within their structural logic. These models are designed to absorb variability in design and function, allowing for classification even when certain operational details are missing or outdated. Yet the inability to reconcile basic identifying characteristics across multiple classification frameworks resulted in a condition where the vessel could not be reliably placed within any recognized category of maritime structure or use. This placed it outside the expected boundaries of interpretive classification, rather than within an unusual but identifiable subset. At the highest level of review, the absence of convergence between independent maritime systems highlighted the layered nature of vessel identity as a distributed construct rather than a singular record, dependent on the alignment of multiple interconnected systems rather than any one authoritative source. This realization did not introduce a new category of explanation, but instead underscored the structural dependency of maritime identification on continuous overlap between registries, tracking systems, and compliance frameworks that collectively sustain visibility across global waters. When that overlap fails to materialize, the result is not a new form of classification, but the suspension of classification itself across all participating systems. Systematic review gradually shifted toward interpretive frameworks that examine maritime activity outside standardized tracking environments, where alternative operational patterns may exist beyond conventional visibility structures. Theories from the shadows of the fishing frontier. Heightened scrutiny of maritime governance gradually shifted focus toward the institutional consequences of persistent gaps in vessel accountability and oversight, where the absence of a coherent identity record was no longer treated as an isolated anomaly, but as a pressure point that exposed how dependent modern maritime regulation is on layered cooperation between enforcement bodies, reporting systems, and commercial actors. At this stage of interpretation, attention moved away from attempting to redefine the vessel itself, and began concentrating instead on the environments in which such vessels are most likely to operate, particularly regions where economic activity at sea develops in parallel with, rather than within, formal regulatory visibility. This shift did not introduce new assumptions about the vessel's identity, but instead reframed the investigative problem as one shaped by environmental conditions of maritime activity itself. Vast stretches of the Indo-Pacific maritime corridor contain regions where distance, weather, and limited enforcement coverage collectively influence how consistently vessel activity can be observed over time, creating a spatial reality in which movement is continuous, but documentation is unevenly distributed. These conditions do not represent emptiness, but rather variation in observational density, where heavily monitored shipping lanes exist alongside expansive areas in which tracking depends on intermittent reporting and indirect confirmation. In such environments, maritime activity is shaped not only by formal routes, but also by adaptive patterns of movement that respond to geography, resource distribution, and operational necessity across wide oceanic distances. The result is a layered maritime space in which visibility itself becomes unevenly structured rather than uniformly applied. Illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing has been documented in multiple international assessments as a persistent global issue affecting ocean governance across both national and international waters, particularly in regions where enforcement capacity does not consistently match the scale or mobility of fishing activity. These assessments describe a wide range of behaviours under a single umbrella classification, from unlicensed harvesting to reporting discrepancies and operations that deliberately avoid standardised documentation. While the specific circumstances vary across regions and fleets, a consistent feature identified in governance studies is that reduced transparency can emerge not from a single mechanism, but from the interaction of economic pressure, geographic scale, and limited enforcement reach across dispersed maritime zones. Within this context, visibility gaps are understood as structural conditions rather than isolated failures. Economic pressures within global seafood supply chains have, in certain contexts, encouraged operational strategies that reduce port dependency and minimize exposure to regulatory inspection points, particularly where efficiency is tied to maintaining continuous movement rather than repeated returns to shore-based infrastructure. In such conditions, logistical decisions are often shaped by the need to optimize time at sea, reduce transit delays, and maintain uninterrupted supply chains, which can result in operational patterns that prioritize offshore coordination over port-based verification. These patterns are not uniform across the industry, but they have been noted in maritime economic analyses as part of the broader complexity of global seafood distribution systems, where operational efficiency and regulatory visibility do not always align. At-sea cargo transfer practices have been observed in both regulated and unregulated maritime operations, allowing goods to circulate between vessels without direct port-based verification at every stage, provided that appropriate reporting procedures are maintained within authorized frameworks. In regulated contexts, such transfers are recorded through coordinated documentation systems that preserve continuity of cargo origin and destination, ensuring traceability across multiple handling points. However, when such coordination is absent or incomplete, the continuity of recorded movement becomes more difficult to reconstruct, not because the physical transfer is inherently opaque, but because the documentation chain that normally accompanies it is no longer consistently present across each stage of movement. This introduces fragmentation into systems designed to rely on sequential continuity. In some maritime contexts, vessels may operate with flexible roles, transitioning between transport, supply, and auxiliary support functions depending on shifting operational requirements, particularly in environments where logistical efficiency depends on adaptability rather than fixed categorization. This functional variability allows vessels to respond to changing demands across different segments of maritime activity, but it also introduces complexity when attempting to interpret their historical role based solely on a single observed configuration. A vessel encountered in one operational state may not reflect its broader function across time, particularly if its role changes in response to regional conditions, economic cycles, or coordinated activity within larger maritime networks. This variability becomes especially significant when historical records are absent or incomplete. Loose operational networks have been identified in maritime studies, where coordination occurs through intermittent contact rather than centralized command structures or fixed registry dependence, forming distributed systems that rely on functional alignment rather than formal institutional oversight. These networks do not necessarily operate outside regulation in a uniform sense, but they can function in ways that do not depend on continuous identity verification across all participating vessels. Within such structures, coordination may occur through temporary alignment of routes, timing, and logistical needs, allowing for movement patterns that are not always fully captured by standard monitoring frameworks designed around persistent identification. The resulting visibility is often partial and context-dependent rather than continuous. Conventional monitoring frameworks are designed around stable identity and continuous reporting, which may not align with operational environments where such continuity is not consistently maintained, particularly in regions where reporting infrastructure is uneven or where participation in tracking systems varies across vessel types and operational contexts. These frameworks assume a baseline of consistent data input that enables reconstruction of movement, but when that input becomes intermittent or fragmented, the resulting record reflects only partial visibility rather than a complete absence of activity. The distinction is significant because it highlights not a failure of observation, but a structural dependence on continuity that may not exist uniformly across all maritime environments. This creates interpretive gaps that must be addressed through inference rather than direct record. Within this broader interpretive framework, vessels exhibiting limited or inconsistent documentation are not uncommon, although the degree of informational absence in this case remains notably uncommon in documented maritime observations, particularly when considered across multiple independent categories of maritime record-keeping that typically retain at least partial traces of vessel activity. Even in cases involving irregular operations, residual indicators often persist through indirect associations such as partial registry entries, intermittent tracking signals, or port-based references. Yet here, the alignment of such traces did not materialize in a way that allowed reconstruction of a coherent operational history. The absence was therefore not simply informational, but structural across multiple verification layers simultaneously. Maritime activity at a global scale encompasses overlapping operational layers that do not always conform to a single unified model of visibility, regulation, or classification, resulting in a landscape where different forms of activity are recorded, monitored, and enforced through systems that do not always share identical coverage or resolution. This layered structure reflects the complexity of coordinating maritime governance across vast and varied oceanic spaces, where economic activity, environmental conditions, and jurisdictional boundaries intersect in ways that produce uneven patterns of observation. Within this structure, certain vessels may appear more clearly within some layers of monitoring than others, creating partial visibility rather than uniform absence or presence across all systems. The interpretive challenge lies in reconciling these mismatched layers into a coherent understanding of maritime behaviour. Expanded examination of maritime oversight limitations brought forward the institutional consequences of sustained gaps in vessel accountability and tracking, particularly in relation to how regulatory systems interpret and respond to cases where multiple independent verification pathways fail to produce a coherent identity record. This shift in focus did not resolve the uncertainty surrounding the vessel itself, but instead redirected attention toward the broader implications of such gaps within maritime governance structures, where accountability depends on the continuous interaction of systems that are not always fully synchronized across jurisdictions and operational domains. The result is a governance environment in which absence itself becomes a data condition requiring interpretation. Reframing of maritime oversight limitations began converging toward the institutional consequences that emerged from unresolved accountability gaps, where the implications extended beyond interpretation and into the political ramifications of how such cases are ultimately addressed. The political embarrassment no one expected. Internal communications within maritime governance structures began circulating structured reports that extended beyond technical interpretation into procedural reviews of how the case had been recorded and communicated across oversight frameworks, where the emphasis was no longer placed on identifying the vessel itself but on understanding how each stage of documentation had been processed, escalated, and interpreted within existing administrative channels. In many maritime investigations, such internal circulation serves as a stabilizing step, allowing agencies to align their findings before any external communication is finalized, ensuring that technical assessments and procedural language remain consistent across departments. In this instance, however, the focus of those communications increasingly reflected not only the specifics of the case, but the broader implications of how maritime anomalies are managed once they move beyond initial field observation and into formal institutional review. The investigative narrative therefore began to exist simultaneously as a technical record and as an administrative case study. Operational summaries compiled by relevant maritime agencies outline the sequence of verification steps undertaken during the initial and expanded stages of identification efforts, detailing how standard procedures were applied in a structured progression from immediate regional assessment to broader cross-referencing across available maritime records. These summaries typically function as internal reconstructions of investigative workflow, designed to preserve a clear record of decision points, system queries, and escalation pathways that define how maritime identification processes unfold in practice. The documentation in this case reflected a procedural completeness in terms of effort and method, while simultaneously reinforcing the unusual outcome that no stable identification could be produced despite the full application of established verification protocols. The emphasis in these records was therefore placed on process integrity rather than outcome resolution. Maritime surveillance capabilities were then examined against expected monitoring standards applied across territorial waters and adjacent international zones under existing operational frameworks, particularly in relation to the assumed continuity of vessel detection through automated systems, cooperative reporting mechanisms, and satellite-supported observation layers. These standards are generally structured around the expectation that maritime activity within monitored regions will produce overlapping streams of data that can be reconciled into coherent movement histories. The examination of capabilities in this context did not focus on a single point of failure, but rather on the alignment between system design expectations and the practical variability of data availability across different maritime environments. This comparison highlighted the dependency of maritime awareness on sustained informational continuity rather than isolated detection events. Differences between internal assessments and publicly released summaries gradually emerged as a point of structural inconsistency within official communication channels, not as a contradiction in factual content, but as a divergence in emphasis and interpretive framing between technical documentation and externally communicated explanations. In institutional settings, such differences are not uncommon, as internal reports often preserve procedural detail and uncertainty that may be streamlined or contextualized differently in public-facing materials. In this case, however, the variation in presentation became a subject of increased attention because it reflected the broader challenge of translating complex verification processes into simplified public narratives without losing essential accuracy. The tension between precision and accessibility became increasingly visible within documentation practices. Administrative considerations surrounding oversight effectiveness introduced broader sensitivity regarding how maritime monitoring capacity is evaluated within governmental reporting contexts, particularly when isolated cases draw attention to the limits of detection and classification systems operating under normal conditions. Such considerations often involve balancing technical accuracy with institutional confidence, ensuring that assessments of capability reflect both the strengths and constraints of existing infrastructure. The emergence of these discussions did not indicate a change in operational capacity, but rather an increased awareness of how individual cases can influence perceptions of systemic reliability when viewed outside their full procedural context. This awareness shaped the tone of subsequent internal evaluations. Formal communication procedures were reviewed to ensure consistency between technical findings and externally issued statements related to maritime detection and classification, with particular attention given to the language used to describe uncertainty, absence of records, and the limits of available verification pathways. These procedures are designed to maintain coherence between different levels of communication, ensuring that technical detail is neither overstated nor oversimplified when presented beyond internal documentation. The review process in this case reflected a standard governance practice, applied with heightened attention due to the unusual convergence of missing data across multiple independent verification systems. The objective remained procedural clarity under conditions of incomplete informational resolution. Parliamentary and regulatory attention began focusing on procedural clarity within agencies responsible for maritime coordination, surveillance, and reporting accuracy, particularly in relation to how investigative outcomes are documented and communicated across institutional boundaries. This attention typically manifests through structured inquiry processes that examine whether existing frameworks are sufficient to account for cases that fall outside expected classification outcomes. In this instance, the focus was not on attributing responsibility, but on understanding how procedural clarity is maintained when standard verification pathways do not produce a definitive result. The inquiry therefore remained centered on systemic articulation rather than individual action. Agency responses consistently emphasized established operational protocols and the defined scope of maritime detection responsibilities under current regulatory frameworks, reaffirming that standard procedures had been followed throughout the investigation, and that the absence of identification did not reflect deviation from expected operational conduct. Such responses are typical in situations where complex or unresolved cases arise, particularly when multiple independent systems have been engaged without producing a convergent outcome. The emphasis remained on procedural integrity, ensuring that the investigative process itself was accurately represented in both internal and external contexts. The consistency of this position reinforced institutional adherence to established operational norms. Cross-agency evaluations highlighted structural dependencies between monitoring systems and reporting mechanisms that shape overall situational awareness in maritime oversight, particularly where data integration relies on the consistent interaction of multiple independent sources. These evaluations did not suggest systemic failure, but rather underscored the extent to which maritime visibility is constructed through layered contributions from distinct operational systems, each of which plays a role in assembling a coherent picture of vessel activity. When these contributions do not align, the resulting gaps become more apparent not because of a single breakdown, but because of the absence of convergence across systems designed to complement one another. The effect is cumulative rather than isolated. Institutional reflection expanded toward understanding how isolated maritime anomalies can expose broader limitations within distributed governance and oversight structures, particularly in relation to how rare or atypical cases are interpreted within frameworks designed primarily for standardized patterns of activity. Such reflection does not alter operational procedure, but it does inform how agencies contextualize exceptional cases within the broader scope of maritime monitoring responsibilities. The discussion gradually moved toward recognizing that certain outcomes reveal not just gaps in information, but the boundaries of interpretive frameworks themselves when applied to non-standard scenarios. This recognition remained within analytical, not speculative boundaries. Procedural closure discussions shifted toward operational resolution steps, involving the physical handling of the vessel and the measures required to conclude its presence within navigable waters. The decision to sink the evidence. Institutional review outcomes prompted a shift in focus from analytical interpretation toward the practical handling of the vessel under established maritime safety and environmental protocols, where attention moved toward the controlled resolution of a physical presence that no longer served an investigative or navigational function. The transition marked a clear procedural boundary within maritime operations, where unresolved interpretive questions were set aside in favor of operational responsibility, defined by safety, containment, and environmental stewardship. In maritime practice, such transitions are governed by procedural frameworks designed to ensure that once a vessel is no longer required for examination, it is managed in a manner that minimizes risk to shipping routes, coastal infrastructure, and marine environments. The decision-making process in such contexts is typically incremental, shaped by assessments that prioritize safety, compliance, and environmental responsibility over any remaining interpretive uncertainty surrounding the vessel's origin or history. At this stage, the vessel ceased to function as an investigative object and became an operational concern. Structural evaluations conducted prior to movement focused on hull integrity, stability under tow, and the risks associated with prolonged exposure in open water conditions, particularly for a vessel that had already undergone extended periods of inactivity and lacked verified operational maintenance records. These assessments are standard in maritime operations involving non-functional or abandoned vessels, where the primary concern is not restoration but safe relocation under controlled conditions. The condition of the hull, combined with the absence of active systems, requires careful consideration of how the vessel will respond to towing forces, wave activity, and structural stress during transit, ensuring that movement itself does not introduce additional hazards to surrounding maritime traffic. Each evaluation step functioned as a constraint analysis, narrowing acceptable operational parameters before any physical action was initiated. Controlled towing procedures were initiated under maritime coordination guidelines designed to minimize navigational risk, while maintaining steady transit toward designated open water areas, where vessel density is significantly lower and the probability of interference with commercial shipping routes is reduced. Such operations require continuous monitoring of tow stability, environmental conditions, and positional tracking to ensure that the movement remains predictable and contained within safe operational parameters. The process is typically conducted at reduced speeds to avoid structural strain, with adjustments made in response to changing sea conditions, reflecting the careful balance between efficiency and safety that defines maritime towing operations involving non-standard vessels. Throughout the operation, stability remained the primary variable of concern. Navigation planning directed the vessel away from coastal and commercial routes, prioritizing open ocean corridors where maritime activity density is significantly lower and where operational decisions can be carried out without introducing risk to established shipping lanes. This redirection is a standard precautionary measure in maritime operations involving potentially hazardous or structurally compromised vessels, ensuring that any unforeseen developments during transit do not impact high-traffic maritime zones. The selection of route reflects a broader principle in maritime safety management, where spatial separation is used as a primary tool for mitigating risk in situations involving uncertain vessel behaviour or condition. The vessel's movement therefore occurred within a deliberately minimized interaction environment. Environmental risk assessments were reviewed to ensure that disposal-related actions complied with regulations governing marine contamination and ecological protection standards, particularly in relation to the potential impact of introducing foreign materials into open water environments. These assessments typically consider factors such as fuel residue, structural materials, and any remaining onboard substances that could affect marine ecosystems if released during or after disposal. The objective is not only to ensure regulatory compliance, but also to minimize long-term environmental disturbance, reflecting the increasing integration of ecological considerations into maritime operational decision-making processes. In this phase, environmental oversight functioned as a parallel constraint system alongside navigational safety requirements. Final onboard inspections were carried out to confirm that all accessible compartments had been assessed and that no remaining operational hazards required mitigation, following established procedures for verifying vessel readiness prior to irreversible operational steps. These inspections serve as a final confirmation stage in which previously recorded assessments are validated against physical conditions, ensuring that no overlooked factors remain that could alter the safety or environmental profile of the operation. In cases involving non-operational vessels, such inspections also function as a procedural closure point, marking the transition from evaluation to execution within the operational sequence. The vessel was thereby confirmed as cleared for final action. Authorization for final disposal was issued through standard maritime decision channels, following confirmation that procedural requirements had been satisfied, reflecting the structured governance framework that governs the handling of decommissioned or hazardous vessels. Such authorization processes are designed to ensure accountability and traceability in decision-making, particularly when actions involve permanent alteration or removal of maritime assets. The issuance of approval does not alter the underlying uncertainties associated with a vessel's history, but instead establishes that all required procedural conditions have been met for the operation to proceed. This separation between procedural legitimacy and interpretive uncertainty remained formally intact throughout the process. Controlled sinking procedures were initiated in accordance with established maritime disposal practices used for decommissioned vessels deemed unsuitable for retention or recovery, following a sequence of actions designed to ensure controlled descent and minimized environmental disruption. These procedures are typically executed under monitored conditions, allowing operators to track the vessel's behavior as buoyancy is gradually reduced and structural integrity transitions from floating stability to submersion. The process is governed by principles of predictability and containment, ensuring that the vessel's final movement is fully accounted for within the operational framework. Each phase of descent was executed under continuous observation. Progressive descent of the hull occurred under monitored conditions, with surface visibility diminishing as buoyancy was gradually reduced through regulated measures, marking the transition from active surface presence to submerged state within a controlled operational environment. This phase of the process is characterized by continuous observation to ensure that descent behavior remains stable and that no unexpected structural disintegration occurs during submersion. As the vessel moves below the surface threshold, it transitions from a navigational object to a submerged mass, no longer interacting with surface-level maritime activity or traffic patterns. The final moments of visibility were recorded as part of standard procedural documentation. Post-operation verification procedures confirmed that the vessel no longer posed a navigational obstruction and had been fully removed from active maritime observation zones, completing the final stage of operational closure within the disposal framework. These procedures ensure that the area is clear of hazards and that all required conditions for safe maritime passage have been restored, in accordance with standard safety protocols. Verification at this stage serves as both an administrative and operational confirmation that the sequence of actions has achieved its intended outcome without residual risk to surrounding maritime activity. The operational record was formally closed following confirmation of compliance. Residual confirmation procedures were concluded as attention shifted away from the operational record itself and toward the broader implications of a vessel whose documented existence ended not through identification, but through controlled removal from the visible maritime environment, the ship that left no past behind. With the vessel now removed from navigable waters, the remaining record of its existence shifted entirely into interpretation, where every conclusion drawn across prior investigations collapsed back into fragments that could no longer be tested against a physical object, leaving only accumulated reports, observations, and procedural notes to carry the weight of what had once been a tangible maritime presence. In maritime documentation, this stage is often where certainty begins to erode most noticeably, not because new information is introduced, but because the anchor point for all previous analysis is no longer available for confirmation or correction. The result is a form of retrospective scrutiny, in which every earlier observation is revisited not to resolve the case, but to understand why resolution was never fully achieved. Physical traces recovered during initial examination, including cargo remnants and structural wear patterns, provided only partial indicators that could not be aligned into a consistent operational narrative, despite repeated attempts to correlate material evidence with known shipping behaviours. The presence of cargo, such as rice for example, offered a narrow but incomplete insight into possible logistical intent, yet without supporting documentation or contextual continuity, it remained an isolated data point rather than a defining feature of the vessel's function. Structural observations, including corrosion and mechanical degradation, similarly suggested prolonged exposure and inactivity, but did not establish a coherent timeline that could connect condition to origin in a verifiable sequence. Corrosion patterns and tow-related damage, while consistent with prolonged exposure and mechanical stress, did not isolate a definitive timeline or origin of the vessel's final condition, leaving interpretation dependent on general environmental exposure models rather than specific historical reconstruction. In maritime analysis, such patterns are typically used to estimate duration and environmental context, but their interpretive value diminishes significantly when detached from maintenance records, operational logs, or identifiable usage history. Without these anchors, physical wear becomes descriptive rather than diagnostic, offering evidence of change without revealing the sequence that produced it. The absence of identifying markings, documentation, and onboard records created a condition in which non-existence of data functioned as evidence in itself, yet remained insufficient to determine intent, ownership, or operational history with any degree of certainty. In most maritime cases, even minimal identifiers can be cross-referenced across registries to reconstruct partial histories, but in this instance, the lack of any such entry points eliminated the possibility of incremental reconstruction. What remained was not a simplified version of a known category, but a structural absence that resisted categorization altogether. Global maritime registries, despite extensive cross-referencing, produced no stable correlation that could anchor the vessel within any verifiable ownership or operational history, even when accounting for possible reflagging, renaming, or administrative transfer scenarios that typically account for discrepancies in maritime records. These systems are designed to absorb variation across jurisdictions and timeframes, yet they depend fundamentally on continuity of entry, even when that continuity is fragmented or transferred. In the absence of any initiating record, the system had no reference point from which to reconstruct lineage. Interpretations based on unregulated maritime economies accounted for certain operational behaviours, but failed to explain the complete absence of traceable administrative continuity, particularly in relation to how a vessel of its scale and structure could exist without leaving any verifiable registry footprint. While such frameworks can account for irregular movement patterns and non-standard operational practices, they still rely on indirect traces such as port interaction, supply chain linkage, or financial association. None of these elements could be reliably connected in this case, leaving economic interpretation without a stable evidentiary foundation. Institutional scrutiny and governance-level analysis addressed oversight and response mechanisms, yet did not extend to explaining the origin or construction of the vessel itself, focusing instead on procedural handling and the limitations of detection and classification systems under real-world conditions. This distinction is important in maritime governance, where responsibility for identification processes is separate from the historical origin of unidentified assets. As a result, institutional analysis clarified process boundaries without resolving the underlying absence of origin data. The final sinking of the vessel resolved its physical presence in navigable waters, but simultaneously eliminated any remaining opportunity for further material verification, converting a recoverable object into a permanently inaccessible reference point within the maritime environment. Once submerged, the vessel transitioned from an inspectable structure to a recorded event, preserved only through documentation rather than physical examination. This shift marks a critical point in maritime cases, where resolution of risk does not equate to resolution of knowledge. Each interpretive framework, when viewed in isolation, provided partial alignment with observed facts, yet none were capable of sustaining explanatory completeness across all known variables, resulting in a situation where agreement existed only at the level of fragments rather than integrated understanding. Material evidence, administrative absence, economic interpretation, and institutional review each accounted for portions of the case, but none were able to bridge the full gap between observation and origin. The result was not contradiction, but incompleteness distributed across multiple domains of analysis. The cumulative result of investigative, economic, and institutional perspectives did not produce a resolution, but instead reinforced the understanding that the vessel was only ever represented through fragments that never formed a single, coherent narrative. Each interpretive framework contributed a partial layer of clarity, yet none were able to extend beyond their own evidentiary limits to connect those fragments into a continuous historical record. What remained consistent across all analyses was not agreement on meaning, but the persistent inability of any single explanatory path to account for the full range of observed absence and material inconsistency surrounding the vessel. The Jian Seng endures only through fragmented records and unresolved accounts that could never restore a complete history of the ship itself.